All right. Well, I am delighted to see all of you. I did not update the work plan at all. So let's sort of postpone that. And then as we end the meeting, we'll go into the work plan together and see what needs to be updated. My personal note to self is don't go on vacation the week before launching an event like this, because then you cram it all into too few days. Live and learn, live and learn. So we'll start with the debriefing the meeting. So I don't know who was able to tune in, but I will say one thing and then look forward to hearing from staff and others who watched the meeting. I am in awe of the group of people who have been assembled to be part of this. The thoughtful comments, the willingness to sort of engage in complex discussion was I literally just sat there the whole time sort of nerding out on what I was learning and the way people were pushing each other's thinking and the responses and reflections. Ruth, I want to say thank you for pushing us to include Barbara Davidson on the list. I think having the historical perspective of someone who was involved in the writing of the current standards, as well as her own reflections on what needs to be changed and how the world has changed in those 13 years was really a valuable contribution last night. And I'm also incredibly thankful for the kids who get to work with some of the teachers we had on this call last night, because listening to some of them engage and how they're thinking about this, the research they want to bring to light for our meetings that are upcoming in the process. I know we have amazing teachers. Last night was a reminder of just how many of our schools are really lucky to have these folks in front of our kids. So I'm going to be quiet. What did folks think of the meeting last night? What went well? What needed improvement? What did the public engagement outside of the meeting itself look like? Because I didn't know if there were any YouTube comments or Twitter or email traffic. And then what questions do you have?
Everyone agrees.
So I'll just say I tried to be on via YouTube and I was more on than off, but I kept getting knocked off. There's something wrong with my something and I don't know what. So I heard a lot, but not necessarily connected. So I don't have a whole lot of response other than I agree with you. It looks like a great group. And but I'd be very interested in sort of your just general take of how you would summarize, sort of where people thought we should start, where we should go. I mean, I heard some interesting back and forth on grade level versus themes and sort of.
Yeah, definitely. I'll happily give my synopsis, but I want to give others a chance to weigh in.
I'm actually looking forward to watching it today. I've actually blocked out some time today, luckily, to watch it. No, but I told you last week or I guess maybe the week before that, I was really excited about the group that was coming together. So I knew those conversations would be great. I was also excited to hear some updates today, but I'm looking really forward to watching it and following the discussion.
Awesome. Karen or Alex or John Paul or Simone?
I can jump in. Hi, everyone. I'm not sure that I've met everyone. I'm Simone. I'm the policy fellow with the state board for the next month or so. I think that there was great diversity of perspective shared. And I think that thinking about the diversity of students that we are aiming to serve through this work, that will ensure down the road that the standards truly promote equity. Just thinking about just who needs what. So I found that to be super, super powerful. The thing I wonder about as things progress is what is decision-making protocol, or like, how do we come to consensus? But I don't think that was necessary for yesterday, but just a lot further down the road it may be necessary as, we're looking to meet deadlines and develop products.
I appreciate that so much, Simone, because that is very much on my mind as well, is what do we do to call the ball on some of these things once we give folks lots of time to air and discuss and share thoughts and push each other. We will have to make some decisions, and I don't have a good answer on that yet, so we'll get there, but I definitely, it is on my mind, so I'm glad I'm not the only one.
This is Alex. I can jump in and provide some thoughts and reactions. Again, echoing, I think, what's been said about diversity of perspective and assembling a group of individuals who, I think, to steal your words, Jessica, just really was awe-inspiring. And really, in my opinion, I think brought forward some issues and some kind of different ways of doing some thinking on this. I think Jessica had raised this at the end of last night's meeting when she had charged the committee with reviewing the standards and presented the committee with a list of questions that state board members and staff had used in reviewing the standards, the current standards. And the amount of feedback that we just got on kind of those questions and like different ways of approaching looking at the current standards was really, really insightful and powerful. And so I really, again, just valued all this expertise that was in the room. I'm quickly looking back at my notes because I think there were a couple of things that really stood out to me. And so pardon me while I skim. Ruth had raised the thematic piece. I think Jessica will probably raise this, but there was affirmation of I think Jessica, they were talking about like the cognitive abilities and capacity of early childhood, like children in grades pre-K through 2, and really the cognitive abilities of kids to really be able to digest and understand and engage with more content. And so I think that was reaffirmed, which was really great. What was the other thing? The other thing, yeah, was somewhat on Simone's piece. I think one thing that I think needs to have just a little bit of clarity on is probably thinking through kind of the process by which this is all happening. We have a really rough structure of like, the advisory committee is going to do this. It's going to present the guiding principles to OSFI, and they'll come back to us and we'll do some sort of review. But I do think we want to make sure that we're intentional and thoughtful with engaging the committee on the process. But I do think we need to put some guide rails up, because we do also need to recognize that there are only, 5 more meetings left?
Yeah.
And this work has just started. And Jessica, you did a really incredible job of keeping everybody on track and keeping it to a 2-hour meeting. I think we ended right at 7. And I was just really impressed with kind of the management and shepherding of that, but also the rich amount of engagement that still happened virtually. One thing that I think you did a good job about, and I should go back to the video and watch this, but I'd be curious to know if everybody who attended had the opportunity to engage, and you're shaking your head.
No, there are a couple people who didn't, and I made note of them because I want, when Karen and I reach out for one-on-one calls, to make sure that we find an appropriate way to sort of ask adults, like, how do you want us to engage you? Because you didn't speak. And that may be because there are folks who sort of hold back and wait and want to reflect and will reach out later. But there were, I think, 4 people who didn't speak other than the introduction. And so I want to understand, because I figured in the first meeting I wasn't going to cold call folks, but I don't want to miss valuable voices who didn't voluntarily raise their hand to speak.
Yeah, Jessica, this is Trump. I mean, I think I agree with you too. Like that's the way to follow up with those 4. because it very well may be that they just don't feel comfortable talking in a group like that and want to participate some other way. So I think saying, hey, notice that you didn't speak on at the meeting, but we really want to hear your voice, and so are there other ways that you want to engage and how to do this, and that type of thing. I think that's a really great, smart idea.
Thanks. I figured, there are lots of reasons people might have held back in the first meeting as well. So don't want to yet assume that will be the case for all the meetings, but look forward to that individual follow-up. And Alex,
Yes.
thank you for that.
This is Karen. You asked a question that I didn't get a chance to answer. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Last night was very informative for me because one of the things they were talking about were the civic differences, the cultural differences, the historical differences, and I never thought from that perspective. And enlightening to see how each person entered this circle on a different and gave information on a different plane, depending on what they perceived the social studies standards to be about. And that was quite eye-opening for me. As a matter of fact, I really didn't sleep thinking about how when I was in school, we were taught civically about the civics and that type of part of social studies, and not the historical significance of social studies learning. So I'm glad I sat in on it last night. Thank you for allowing me to do that.
Thanks, Karen. John Paul, anything you would add? And Caitlin, I don't know if you watched or had a chance, so I want to make sure we hear from you too if you've got thoughts.
I can share about, sorry, this is Caitlin. I can share about the public engagement because I do the live streams. So there were about 52 total views by the end of the live stream, and probably average 24 concurrent viewers during the live stream. But then once I checked back this morning, there were about 60 something views. So people are definitely going back and watching it after the fact. We did get 2 comments during the live stream. One was somebody just commenting that they were going through the standards from grades 9 to 12 and commented something about civics. And then the other person just asked if the live stream would be available afterwards. So, I mean, not the most amount of engagement in the comments, but maybe there'll be more in future meetings.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. Ruth, go ahead. You're on mute, friend.
One quick thing in terms of the public engagement. When I was watching on YouTube, one thing is the slides covered all of the people. And so that makes it hard to follow, I think. So I don't know if there's a way to fix that, but that might be something to look at in the future.
Yeah, definitely agree, Ruth. I mean, one thing I think, and I hope we can talk more about this as we go through the syllabus and what we want to do next, is my hope is that we won't have a ton of pre-presented information, and that decks will get out to folks in advance of meetings. So for instance, one thing I'm hoping we can do for next meeting, we asked folks to read the standards in advance of the next meeting, and we agreed on some guiding questions. I'd like to send a Google Form survey before the next meeting for folks to write their reflections in advance of our discussion, so that we can put together some slides that say, on this question, these were common things that emerged. On this question, these were things that emerged. On this question, these were things that emerged. And send that deck ahead of time so that folks can have it with them. And then we can maybe take it down from the public view, because we all have it posted ahead of time. We can flash it up and then stop sharing so that we can see the sort of Brady Bunch approach. But I appreciate that, Ruth, that's something I would not have known, that oh, right, people watching see the slide and just the couple of faces as opposed to the whole crew, because I had to keep scrolling through to find people's faces. John Paul?
This is John Paul. So that, I mean, that is a challenge. On the opposite side, when we're doing a presentation like that and broadcasting it to YouTube, the slides really do need to be the full screen, or people on YouTube can't see it. And so Ruth is absolutely right. We do lose the faces, but if we're talking about something specific, like we were about the differences between like grade level and that type of thing, it's really important to have that on the screen so that people know what we're talking about. So it's another thing to note, right? Like there are trade-offs either way. Like I'm with Ruth. I would much rather see, like I always go to gallery view to see everybody's faces, and so I want to be able to see that. And so that, anyway, just to note that is a challenge, even when we're doing our working session meeting.
Okay, it's a helpful challenge. So Ruth, to your question about sort of summarizing, I probably need to sit with it a little longer to make sure I get it all in, but I will say that the things that stuck with me from yesterday were that we got a group of experts that represent the kinds of things we said we cared about in our resolution. So we have folks who care about early childhood and agree that there needs to be more cognitive lift in those standards, that the students are able, it is developmentally appropriate for younger students to be doing more cognitive lift than our current standards have. So we have folks on the advisory committee who already brought that way of thinking. So I'm excited that that will come up in there. Similarly, lots of folks spoke about this need for the standards to focus on civics, on dispositions. So not just facts and skills, but also these sort of habits of mind or dispositions around civic engagement. One thing that was also evident in the people's self-introductions, I don't remember clearly which of these things were captured in their application answers and not, but I heard a lot more people say they were DCPS graduates than I thought we had. So that was tremendous. Like the number of people who went through DCPS and graduated from DC public schools and are now participating in this is really heartening, because they're bringing their own experiences as former students as well. The other thing is there were two folks who spoke up about their doctoral programs that I don't think they mentioned in their applications either. And that was exciting. So we also have folks who are in the work as educators in our K-12 system, but who are also working from an academic perspective. So that was exciting. The other thing, that was sort of the people who are aligned with the kinds of things that the state board highlighted in our resolution. I think that the piece about needing the standards to be actively anti-racist was also a common theme in people's introductions and purposes for joining the committee. A couple of other things that came up were sort of big overarching questions around the scope of what is possible in this standards revision. So we had one member ask before the meeting and then raise it in the meeting, this question of like, are we contemplating what changes to the standards might mean for changes to graduation requirements? We had folks ask about course progression and whether that might be something that would change as a result of the standards. We did not come to conclusions in this meeting, so I want to be really clear on that, but these were things that folks raised. So I do think, to Alex's point about guardrails, we do have to keep in mind from the state board perspective and in working with OSSI, like where this could go and what folks' interest is and where they want to have influence.
Jessica, sorry, this is John Paul real quick. I mean, I think one of the other things too for the guardrails is there's some of these questions that are kind of beyond the scope of what the state board has. So what we could say is these are questions and they are good questions, and we're going to punt. So we're going to say, the advisory committee could recommend that the state board ask ask OSSE to, as part of this review of standards, make a recommendation on that too. Right? To examine course progression, to examine, something like that. So we could not cut off that conversation, but put it where it needs to be, which is likely at OSSE rather than with us, and then be able to then focus for our 5 meetings on the things that this advisory committee really has to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John Paul. I think that's a smart course of action, and I do think that we have to say something. I just didn't think we had to say it last night. So I think this is a good suggestion on what to say and how to proceed. 2 other things, Ruth, on sort of summary. One was this concept of the grain size of the standards came up a few times. So standards being not just a list of who, what, when, but also thinking about how we make standards the right grain size so that we are understanding that there's a need for flexibility in how the standards are addressed by teachers at schools and curricula, but not making them so large as to be murky for those purposes. So the Goldilocks problem, if you will, getting the just right size of a standard. Lots of good thoughts people had around standards as a rights document, the idea around these standards being what our students have a right to learn about, meaning that in some ways they dictate that we can't cut an element of the curriculum. We can't cut social studies because these standards say our students have a right to learn these things. I think that was a way I had not heard it framed before, and one that really resonated with me, and I think fits a lot of the state board's priorities, both around well-rounded education as well as the standards. And then in terms of the things people are specifically thinking about these standards, all the tensions that we surfaced as a board committee came up in last night's conversation. So breadth versus depth, and thinking about the standards thematically so that we get long arcs of historic thinking and not sequential lists that don't help students develop that connected thinking, not just between events and history, but also how economics and history and politics and geography connect and create the realities of our world, past and present. Folks have a real interest in bringing in research on what we know about writing standards, what we know about setting standards, what we know about how different approaches to standards, thematic, sequential, historical. So 2 of our members, Daniel Espinas and Scott Abbott, have offered to follow up with some research resources that they want the committee to have access to. So looking forward to following up with them on that. Bringing in outside experts. We had a good conversation around that, around some of the outside experts that folks would like to hear from. And so I got a couple of emails with specific names of experts, as well as different organizations that folks want to make sure we reference or hear from. So folks like Teaching for Tolerance and Facing History and ourselves. This question of the C3 framework came up a lot, and about how we might use this framework in the way we think about our standards. A number of folks who have previous standards expertise talked about how it was either used in crafting curriculum from the standards, or it was used in rewriting standards. So the C3 framework was another thing that came up. And then thinking about how we approach the review of the standards, we got into this conversation about the possibility of subcommittees by grade level or by discipline. And where we landed was everybody's going to read all the standards first, and we're going to come back to this topic. But there's a real tension over, if we were to go by grade level, do we miss the vertical alignment and long arc thinking? If we go by discipline, do we miss the interconnectedness? And so starting with the whole set of standards before making any decision about breaking up into part was the way we decided to proceed. Anything I missed, Alex or John Paul, that you would add?
I mean, I can certainly talk about my favorite word.
You can.
So there was some discussion yesterday about using the standards to help students know how to critically think about history. And one of the ways to do that is through the process of historiography, which so I was a history major. I will freely admit that I am a huge history nerd, and historiography was one of the classes that I was required to take as an undergrad, and it was simultaneously one of the most boring classes I've ever taken, and also one of the ones that I use most often in my like reading and all of these things. And the whole point of historiography is to, thanks Alex, to really examine history with that critical eye and be able to look at an event or a person and understand not only them but the context that they were in, and then how that context relates to your own context of understanding of the world. And I really like the idea of bringing in that type of concept into standards, so that whatever we put in terms of lists of people, places, things, whatever, the idea of being able to provide that critical thinking and being able to look at an event, a person, or whatever with that context, I think will be critical in terms of helping students and helping these standards, frankly, exist for a while, because things change so rapidly, right? So we don't necessarily have to have huge lists of people if we're teaching them how to examine history in a way that isn't just bland facts on a page.
Thank you, John Paul. I am very excited to begin using the term historiography. Alex, what else would you add to the summary?
Yeah, one other thing was, and I thought this was very interesting. I don't know if it was with all that raised it or Daniel, but they had, raised a very pointed question. Is the state board going to ask this committee to look to a particular state or place as an option? Or is the state board going to be looking to this committee and to an eventual writing committee to really do a refresh and to start anew? And I thought that was an interesting question. And I think, Jessica, you have responded, we've looked previously at, what other states have done in the past, but we're not necessarily looking to say, oh, California standards are really great right now, or Michigan standards are really great right now. How can we take them and just adapt them? But that this is potentially, and I think Barbara really added to this is potentially a really great opportunity for us to really think about how does the district really lead in the revision of a set of standards that is typically, and I know this word has been used before, contentious when it comes to revisions, or fraught, I think is the word that Barbara used. And so I thought that was a really interesting point too.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alex. So it was Nick Ojeda who had asked about, did we have a set of standards in mind? And I will say this because I think it's important for our board to keep it in mind, because I know it's something we also worry about in education in the city. I think there is enough of a pattern in public engagement within education that folks worry that we're hiding the ball on what we really want from them versus what we've said we want from them. And so that came up a couple times last night. And that was, I think, a good specific example of, are you just going to give us some standards you want us to say, here are the ones we think are best, which would you pick for us to use to adapt? And I said, that is not our plan. We have looked at other standards. We are open to hearing that there are standards we may want to model our approach after, but that we really are about asking folks to engage with us on what our standards should be and become. But Barbara's point about how fraught standards review processes on the social studies is not lost on me. And it is something we have heard from OSCE as well, that, DC has typically adopted existing national standards, Common Core science, or adapted other state standards rather than working in a more generative way. And there's very good reason to be nervous about what happens when we work in this generative way. But I do think that's where we are at the moment, is saying we want to get people's reactions to the standards. We want to figure out what the best course of action is, but we are not hiding intentions about how we want to approach this. And I hope that we can hold to that and really work with folks. So once I have a chance to go through the notes that that Alex and the team took last night and the chat, I will make sure that we get those links to everybody on the committee so that folks can read through for themselves. We'll also make sure that this committee is CC'd on the follow-up to the SAC, the SISC. We agreed to follow up on the reflection questions as they read the standards, because as Alex said, I offered the same ones we had used when we reviewed the standards, and folks had some really good feedback on how to change, adapt, and update those. So we'll talk to these folks from the SISC by the end of the week so that they can get started on their standards review. But we will keep the committee looped in on all of that. What I want to spend the rest of our meeting on, and then I'll come to you, Ruth. Oh yes, we did have 100% attendance, which is great. I want to make sure that we can take a look at the arc of the learning for the August through December meetings and figure out how to best spend that time, get committee input on what to do and how to move forward. So I'm going to make sure that link is available to everyone. I'll put it here in the chat, but Ruth, go ahead with what you were thinking about.
I was just going to chat it. I just wanted to see if we could see the reflection questions and also see if there's anything that we thought should also get added based on our previous review. And we don't have to do it now. I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, just so you see, Ruth, these are can you see the slide?
Not yet, sort of, yeah.
So I've highlighted the questions that we proposed last night, and there was lots of good feedback on ways we should add. So for the second question, well, for the first one, it was suggested that we ask specifically, in addition to diverse historic and cultural perspectives, are there places where the standards are actively anti-racist or where they are not, and where we would push on that? For the second question, there was a request that we talk about the cognitive lift of the standards, where that cognitive lift needed adjustment. And I think that largely came from folks in the early grades. There was a question around where the standards are or are not promoting civic engagement, since that was a piece that we've identified as a goal of revision of the standards. On the sequencing and building of knowledge, there was also a question around synthesis of themes and content, like where were there opportunities for that? Those are the ones that I have noted down just on my own, handwritten notes on the PowerPoint, but I will make sure that we go through the chat, update those. Are there other things that are on your mind, Ruth, now? If not,
just the one that I want to add, and I can chat it here, is just sort of along with the civics, is kind of the extent to which the standards do and don't promote an understanding of sort of the promise of democracy and both the progress and failure of democracy, the development of democratic principles and the way in which they did and didn't serve us over time. Just so that's just as people are looking at some of these other questions very specifically, that they look at that one specifically. That's all.
So just say a little bit more about that, Ruth, because I'm not sure I understand.
That's good.
exactly what you're asking.
So as we go through the standards, are people learning about what are the rights that are in the Constitution, the way in which those rights do and don't get realized in different eras by different people? What are the threats to it? Because I think for me, part of this is creating that kind of the tension between the promise, certainly one of the main themes in American history, I think, is the tension between sort of the promise of democracy and the failure of it. And just to make sure that's coming through, that people get a sense. I mean, as I have said in the past, at the end of this, I'd like people to be able to sort of get, wow, it really is a problem. We really do need checks and balances. Here's why. And for people to understand that there was a reason that went in. And when you sort of come to the end of this and you're in 12th grade and you're in your civics class, these things sort of make sense because you've looked at them in previous times.
So for you, this is really a question about the content of civic knowledge and promise and failure of democracy rather than a disposition.
Exactly, which is exactly.
Okay.
That's why I'm saying both in our original resolution and in subsequent conversation, we've talked about both the civics and the democratic principles, democratic history. So you're exactly right.
Yep. No, happy to call that out. One thing I would add too, and then I'll go to Marcus because I saw your mouth but didn't hear your voice. Sorry. Fadal Moore, who's one of our committee members, specifically called out the lack of clear civic content from grades 3 through 8. And that's a key piece for him. And then one of our other members, Dr. Warden from American, is civics is her field. And she's been studying civics and how civics is taught and inculcated around the world. So I think you'll have good voices on the committee who will certainly be happy to see that question, but I think we'll also make sure we keep attention on that. Marcus, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess to that point, I was going to say, I know Karen Lee will not let us let up on that by the end of this conversation. My second question was, and I thought about it as I was looking at the pre-work questions, and I know this was a part of the aim of our work, and I'm sure we'll get to it later, but at what point are members also going to be like, as we're reviewing the standards, are there certain sections or tellings of our history or certain things we're requiring students to learn that jump out as racist to you just kind of immediately, right? And so like thinking about like the anti-racist framing of our standards and like and just how we guide people along on that, right? And quite frankly, right, everybody's not going to be in the same place in the group, so how we bring people along as well as a part of the conversation, I think, is important too.
Thank you for that, Marcus. I think that's a good call out, and perhaps part of the wording of adding in the anti-racist is to say, where are the standards racist? Where are they anti-racist? I think another piece that folks mentioned last night, which I was glad they brought up, is the fact that some of our standards probably need to go, that we can't simply add standards, that there may be standards that need to be removed. And I think that these questions that we're asking may help us get to a list of which standards no longer serve us and our students, maybe need to go. So I appreciate that. I will make sure that we share a draft of the email before it goes out to the CISIC and get any additional feedback. All right, shall we look at a syllabus?
Sorry, I also might have missed this part. I was going to say, have we also thought about how we have a conversation about filling in the last 2 decades of history? like all of the history since I was born. How do we do that?
Well, so it's so interesting. We haven't gotten there yet, but I that is very much on my mind, Marcus, is as we think about that, like, where do we talk about that, right? You certainly don't want it to just get added on to the high school classes. So we've got to think about how that gets woven in throughout, I think. I don't have a way to talk about it yet because I'm still just churning over it in my mind, but this long arc of historical thinking is, I think, another way to think about that. Like, if we can develop our standards in such a way that we draw these long through lines and these continuous arcs, I hope that makes it easier for folks to facilitate teaching modern history along with further back history and drawing those long lines. I would say Jessica Rucker from Yale Haynes brought this up last night, the notion of some of the modern movement we're watching and the actions for Black lives and this calling out of police brutality, that for some folks, it is new knowledge to know that this is not acts of the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, but this is a 400-year arc of violence against Black bodies by white authority figures. And how do we think about all of our historical concepts in that long arc thinking of like what is true in the present and what are the building blocks and points at which that history could have been different, wasn't different, or developed over time?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to think about it. And then there's also those things like global terrorism, right? That are just like very new concepts, and like how we introduce that. Yeah, it's just, or like global disease. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's less new than right global terrorism, but still, something that like how we use that arc to talk about like more recent history, but also to talk like how we weave in current events too, I think is important. But yeah, I might just be going off on a tangent, but that's
no, but you're bringing up a lot of the stuff that's sort of churning for me too. I don't have good answers yet, but I'm glad to have it.
So the obvious, I think, in terms of when I talk about the democratic story, it's one of those arcs. It's one of those arcs of history.
Yes.
Talk about.
And Ruth, I think you've judged for We the People before, right?
I've what? Yeah.
Have you judged the We the People?
I don't think I've judged. I've witnessed. Having not taught, I don't like to. I find it hard to judge those things, but
I think one of the things that your point brings up is that is something I always found the We the People texts do particularly well, which is this: here are the elements of the Constitution. These are the places it shows up over time. These are the places where those rights and responsibilities were tested. So thinking about how we make sure that our standards bring that work to light. Okay, without further ado, our syllabus. I put the link in the chat for folks. We had talked about this at a previous committee meeting and really fleshed out the first meeting. I want to spend some time fleshing out the second meeting. Best intentions, I'd hoped to have it more fleshed out for this meeting, but that did not happen. And then thinking about how we build out these remaining meetings we have with people. So just as a refresher, when we built this syllabus, this came from the project plan and what we had talked about with OSSI, what our advisory committee would do. So that's how we picked what's in those meeting slots right now. I think next meeting needs to focus really deeply on both reflections on current standards and what they think is worth keeping, what they think needs changing, how they would change it, all the questions we just talked about, all those sort of guiding questions. So I think that in and of itself will fill in 2 hours. I think the question is, how do we best facilitate that so that we also can bring in outside expert voices or outside perspectives that we don't think are, that we want to make sure are in the room. So very open to thoughts on that. Also want to ask for feedback on those next meetings, September, October, November. How we best use that time to tackle some of these things that came up last night, these questions around tackling some of these emerging themes, build to consensus around what goes into the guiding principles, and creating a process to make sure we put those guardrails up as we begin those discussions. So let's dig in on next meeting.
Yeah, that, I guess early in like the high school grad rec stuff, I think that was where we also just thought really hard about how we move along the conversation. And we used a lot of chart paper, as John Paul probably remembers. I that won't necessarily work in the virtual setting, but I mean, there's a virtual version, you know, but I don't know, just maybe it's something like a KWL chart or some version of that where it's just like, well, look, here's the things we know we want to tackle, the things we know we want to dive into. And then once you get to like the things that we want to know or want to learn, then maybe that will set a really good framework for the type of experts you invite in subsequent meetings. Because I'm sure there'll be folks who show up, in 3 weeks and just say, the like, or the group will have a consensus on, yeah, these are really things we need to dive into. And then I'm sure there'll be like big things where people are like, I just don't know. And I think that'll really give a good roadmap.
I totally agree with that, Marcus. And I'm thinking now, like, how do we do some of that group processing that I also am very accustomed to doing with chart paper? Thoughts, suggestions on how we do this in a virtual setting? And thank you, Alex, for correcting my dates. I don't know. Those are clearly old, and I missed that. So thank you.
As far as kind of like breaking out and chart paper stuff to Marcus's point, I know there is a capability in WebEx to actually do a screen share and have people engage on like a whiteboard that could promote some of that, whether or not it's, there's a key question and we ask people to write things down on it and we can capture a variety of things. It does raise concerns, or not necessarily concerns, but logistical issues with, having 26 people engage that way. I think we do need to identify a way to break out, and whether or not that means that we deviate from WebEx to a different platform or start some sort of conversation with a panel discussion for a first 45 minutes to an hour, and then people are then given different links to break out. Those are some of my initial musings and sputterings and spatterings.
Yeah, I will share, because I don't know actually if all the committee members know this. So we did try last week before this meeting the WebEx option that allowed for breakout rooms, but it's a trainings module tool rather than this virtual meetings tool. And the breakouts meant that you could hear each other but not see one another. So you were sort of these disembodied voices without visual, which was like, well, why not just get on a conference call? So didn't turn out to be the best tool at the time. So we didn't want to do that for this first meeting, but we are talking about exploring other options, whether any of the other approved platforms like Microsoft Teams, et cetera, offers that sort of virtual breakout space.
Yeah. And I'm sure I would assume that Zoom is not one of the approved platforms, but the Zoom rooms actually was a part of a meeting where we broke out into the Zoom rooms, and that was really cool because you could also yank people back at a predetermined time. But yeah, I also know the complexities with using Zoom for stuff like this. And then also I'll just say during the grad rec stuff, if we wanted to like have people reflect at the beginning of the meeting, or like where we wanted to collect responses about something, sometimes we did like a what do we call them, like an exit sheet, where
tickets.
people yeah, or it could be like something at the beginning of the meeting. I don't know why I'm thinking of it as a do now. Clearly I've been in school really recently, but like one of those like things to jump off the conversation. People get to write down their thoughts and then either share as a group or break out into smaller groups and share. But I think that might also be a way to, solicit some of that feedback.
We could potentially use Zoom. We don't have an official account with it, but we could start trying to maybe think about that type of thing. I mean, there would be a cost associated, right? The other thing that we could potentially do, right, which is another one of the things that the ESSA task force did, was entire meetings in group, or most of the meeting in a group, right? So if we do something like that, we could establish 3 different WebEx meetings and then have everyone come back to a central place at a particular time. Like, you know, that transition time would still need to be booked into it, but we could do that.
And I would also presume that that would present logistical challenges with like broadcasting and like public viewership.
Well, maybe. I mean, unless we did 3 different streams or how many different streams from the thing. I mean, I think we could try to figure it out, and Caitlin, in her infinite patience, could probably try to teach us, some of us, like how to do some of the streaming pieces of it. The other piece of it is, you know, we could, when we did the ESSA ones, we just didn't record those. Recorded them audio, but didn't do them on video. That's not really the preference, I think, but we could also, because WebEx does this recording thing, we could just post them the next day, right? It wouldn't be as publicly interactive as what I think we would probably want, but it still would be there.
Yeah. Yeah, the cost factor is always a thing, because I will say, to Marcus's point, Zoom is what I use with my online classes at American, and the Zoom rooms are really, they're a very cool tool that gives a little bit, they're just very flexible. But I think figuring out how we virtually engage is a question worth tackling. And I will definitely defer to Caitlin's wisdom and learnings on this. So that's one piece of it. What about, so I want to come back to the question Simone posed at the beginning around this about getting to consensus. So if I look at this arc of meetings, and the goal is to have the state board vote on the guiding principles by the December public meeting. In this syllabus, we optimistically say, oh, we'll do it in November. But the goal, the hard stop is December public meeting. So if that's the case, backwards planning, I think we get at most 1 more meeting of sort of open source debate, discussion, raise ideas. And then by September, we have to start culling things and saying, okay, now we've got to have a process in place for consensus building. That's my sense. But I don't know what others think. Like, should we have a more consensus building process in place for next meeting? Is there value in letting people take 1 more meeting to sort of air ideas openly before we start boxing folks in?
Can I jump in?
Please.
So I don't know that you need a decision-making protocol next meeting, but I do think you need to be able to clearly capture trends, because it's almost as if there were different groups of people saying the same thing. Like Jessica was going to say anti-racist. If you let her have the mic, it's just what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. So I think this is where I would maybe come back to what John Paul just raised in terms of potentially setting up the 3 different WebExes. But I think with the 3 different WebExes, there need to be protocols where we're capturing takeaways and trends, and potentially like a Google Doc of some sort, like a capture, I think they call it, I don't know the right word, a note catcher. Because I think from a note catcher, you would be able to pull themes to be able to like present where the advisory committee is landing on certain things. And I think from there, you would be able to come to the September meeting with a decision-making protocol and just, this is where we are on things. So that's just like my bigger, like, not really parsed out thinking around what that could look like and how that could happen.
No, thank you for that, Simone. I mean, one thing that I always feel a tension about is, because these are public meetings, having public access to documents. If I was teaching a class, the way I would do it is set up a Google Doc, give everybody the live link to the Google Doc, and have 3 different columns. And so room A is in this column, room B is in this column, room C is in that column. and then you're live typing into your own column, but you're actually able in real time to start to see what your peers are talking about and discussing, where the points of synthesis are and where the points of divergence are. We're prevented from doing that. I just don't know how we safely protect it. I guess if we were all in a WebEx together, the chat in the WebEx is private to that group. So folks on YouTube wouldn't be able to just jump in the Google Doc. So I mean, I love that idea of actually beginning to use August to capture those threads so we authentically source our decision-making process from what folks are saying and doing. If you haven't caught on to it yet, like this is a deep commitment I've got to this, but also a total nervousness of like, I want this process to really honor what we've told people we're doing.
No, that definitely resonates.
And there's like 17 ways we could go wrong in any given moment. So I'm gonna try and avoid them.
Yeah, and then I'll say I think during Grad Rex, we were also very clear, like, you know, this is what we like, especially so for instance, if we were on the other end of the August meeting, the September meeting, for instance, we were saying, okay, well, this is what we heard, right? Is this on these points, do we have consensus? And where we do, I think most of the time it was relatively easy to identify. But then we also weren't afraid to also, like we established from the beginning that everything we want to establish consensus on, but there'll be key, very salient points that we also include in kind of like a minority report or also you should consider report that didn't necessarily like lock to the broader group's recommendations, but were still important, you know, takeaways from the conversation that we thought were important to include. So I think that was also really important too.
Yeah, I think that's powerful, Marcus, the idea of sort of the dissenting opinion and making sure that we have the space for that so that you've got the consensus, so the dissent.
And the dissent, but also the things where like because for instance, we spent quite a bit of time on, for instance, things like financial literacy. Like, should we include financial literacy as like a math, like something that could qualify as like a math requirement? And we talked about that for a long time and just couldn't come to a real consensus. Or like community service, right? I think our recommendation was to eliminate it altogether, but then there were tons of people who were like, well, let's redefine community service, or let's do this, or let's do that. And like I think we also expressed in that like our real conversations and like real struggles with those issues, that and listed the reasons why they didn't end up right in the bigger conversation. So yeah, the dissent, but also like those really sticky points that the broader group couldn't come to consensus on, but are worth like considering even further, you know?
Yeah, I like that. Ruth, what are you thinking about this options for getting towards consensus building? You're on mute.
That all makes sense to me. I don't have as much sort of fluency with the different process stuff. Certainly not technologically. It all makes sense to me. The one thing I want to throw out, and I don't know where to put it, is how, and I know we've talked about this, and I don't want to be a broken record on it, but at some point, how do we bring into the conversation? We have these terrific social studies teachers, largely, and some people in the broader social studies world. How do we bring in the kind of I'm going to call it the new history, and that's really not the right thing because it's not that new, but it's not in our standards, you know? And people have different levels of familiarity with it, and there's, you know, there's issues around at what point, you know, at what point do you regard the new historical understandings as what you put into a history book, what you put into the history standards, you know? And what is the state of that? What's the state of historical consensus, so to speak, on some of these big changes, presumably, that we want to make in the history standards or in the social studies standards? When and how do we bring that in? And let me just throw in one thing, which is, I just had a conversation with someone at the Smithsonian who works on their K-12 stuff. And there's, I think, she hopefully is going to email you, Jessica, about connecting the committee to the American History Museum, the African American History Museum, and I think the Indian Museum on sort of their K-12 people.
Yeah, so just noting, Ruth, because that's a really good point. Maria Marable Bunch, who's on our CISIC, is the education director, and I want to get her title right. So Alex, I don't know if you have it handy, at the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. She also helped create the museum magnet programs at Stewart Hobson and Brent. So she's been involved with DCPS, the Smithsonian, the intersection of that for a long time. And I think she might actually be the current director at the museum. So glad we've got another person that you're going to connect us with. We also have that sort of internal CISIC membership. I wonder about the experts, because I've been churning on this, Ruth, and I haven't meant to ignore it. I don't have a good answer yet, because this came up last night as well, and I think Barbara Davidson really gave voice to it. I think maybe Sally Schwartz also brought it up, which is this group, this CISEC's job is to give us guiding principles for how the standard should change. Then we're giving that over to OSSE, right? We're going to vote on it. We're going to give it over to OSSE, and they're going to assemble a writing group. I think there's value in having experts on historical changes talking to this group. I imagine it's going to become incredibly important that those experts are present for the writing of standards and giving input there. I just don't know. I guess the enormity, the sort of size of this is what's hard for me, because when we say experts on the new history, or world history, US history, the history of slavery, the history of immigration, the history of the Great Migration, like who are we asking to come in on?
Well, I'll just say, based on both our internal conversation and the conversation last night, I think probably the biggest focal point for revising the standards without dismissing other parts is how you revise the view of American history. I think that's what so much of this, the focus is on, whether we're talking about the anti-racism, whether we're talking about what's changed in how we think of history, in the past 2 decades. So my focus would be American history, I guess. And I think to have somebody talk to me, and maybe you'll say, well, all the, these are all social teachers, they all know about it, they're all up to date on it. But I think someone who can talk about sort of the major ways in which this has changed. You and I talked about sort of Isabel Wilkerson and the Great Migration. That really, it's not in our standards, and it's a huge piece of current thinking about American history. So what else is like that we don't even know? Maybe people at the table all know it, but I don't know, and I don't want it lost.
Yeah, no, I hear that, Ruth. I don't. So let me say this: given my own perspective as a former teacher, I didn't know this, so I don't want to assume that people at the table all know it. I also don't want to assume that we don't have knowledge in the room from folks who may be able to instruct us on this. So as an example, I think it was Melanie Holmes, who, while she talked about being a middle school educator, is also a doctoral student at Howard studying Black power through the African diaspora. So he's going to have knowledge to bring to bear on the table as a doctoral student on Black power and Black history, where I guess I'm worried. And I again, I'm not saying that because I don't want to do it. I'm saying it because I don't know how to get my hands around it. I don't know where to find an American history generalist who can say, here are all the places in American history we need to do that examination. I don't, because my experience is that there are folks who are historians of the American story, but they are folks focused on Reconstruction, or they are focused on the Great Depression, or they're focused on late 20th century, or they're focused on presidential history, rather than sort of a generalist on American history. Maybe someone from Gilda Lehrman might be worth pulling in, like on how they're doing professional development for educators in updating the story of American history. That's where my brain like I can't get myself around who do we invite in to do this without inviting in 45 people.
So following up on sort of Gilda Lehrman, thinking of the African American Museum in particular, I mean, if we could get someone to say, or 5 people to say, or somebody who talks to 5 people, right? Here's the 5 things that we think have most, that are central to understanding American history, that are central to the themes that we've laid out, the anti-racism, the civics, the democracy. What are the 5 things that we should really be focused on that maybe have shifted either in American history or, hey, look at our standards. What's not here? You could do it that way either. And you'd get something like, and I don't know, but there's been a huge shift in how people think of Reconstruction and convey it than what is certainly, you know, well, it's not that, you know, in our standards, you know, you could, and you'd have sort of, you need to think about Reconstruction, you need to think about the Great Migration, and there's, you know, 3 or 4 people who know American history broadly and who follow what's going on everywhere, people who follow African American history, because that's clearly a focus of it, to give us, you know, half a dozen things that are most important. That's sort of what I'm thinking of. And then we go from there. That's
So,
my thought.
I think, I mean, what I think then, just as I'm listening to you say these things, I'm thinking that it makes sense to harness both our associate director for museum learning and programs at the National Museum of the American Indian and the person you want to connect me with from the Smithsonian, to start with that, to say, who would you all bring to us? Who would you recommend that we speak with? Who have you learned from, or what resources do you already have to share with us that we should be thinking about? I think the second thing that comes to mind is, I think this is something we should also communicate to OSSE to make sure that it starts with the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee, but that it also is a thread that runs through to the Writing Committee. And so that whatever resources we're collecting, we will also catalog in such a way that we hand that off with the guiding principles to say, these are the principles we've landed on, and these are the resources we assembled here, so that we can follow up and let them build on work underway.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess the reason I keep coming back to it is, to me, a principle is, and maybe this is sort of, nobody else is thinking this way, but to me, a principle would be, here are a set of things that we know in our standards don't reflect what's currently thought of in sort of kind of the mainstream of American history thinking now. You know, Reconstruction, the Great Migration, and 3 other things. And that's part of our principle that we want to pass on, but we don't know what those things are. And I guess that's sort of what I'm trying to get at, is what are those things? And we should know them. And you know, that's all. Point made.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, Ruth. And I think, you know, you and I are highlighting one of the tensions that our committee highlighted as well, which is, I think it will be helpful if we can name 3 or 4 or 5 things, but what we don't want is for people to misconstrue that what we're saying is add these 3 things in and then we're happy. But rather that these 3 things is the push to say, these are exemplars of ways that we want you to examine the standards and rewrite the standards to include things previously missing.
Previously missing
But
and
not limited to.
yeah, and connected to the arcs, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think too, Ruth, and I think part of this is like there, and I know we've had this tension since the start as a board. We're not writing the standards, so it's making sure we bring up the things we want to be attended to in the writing, but also acknowledging that the writing lies outside of our purview. And that is a, true but complex.
yeah, I don't disagree with that. It's just to raise the principles, we need to know more. But that's, anyway, that's, point made. So.
Okay.
But I'll get back to that person at the museum if she hasn't written yet and I haven't seen anything, so.
Great. No, I'd appreciate that. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes left together, and I just want to, I will spend time drafting out a further agenda and sharing it with this group for the August 11th meeting, knowing that we do not have another committee meeting until August 12th, but that I will share an update at the August working session. So that will be the next time sort of I can share what's what on that. If we work on this, capturing the threads, as Simone really thoughtfully put, and then thinking about bringing in expert voices or expert resources that might follow from those threads. September looks like we've also got to think about actually cementing a decision-making process, or forming that decision-making process. And then October is when we talked about thinking about public engagement and really using the month of October for active public engagement. So one thing I want to put on the horizon for our next committee meeting in August is I want us to be thinking about how to thoughtfully design how we will engage with the public under two sets of circumstances: a wholly virtual world, a mostly virtual world, and a more in-person world. Because I looked at sort of previous engagements the board had around grad rates and ESSA, and there were lots of in-person opportunities for engaging with the public. And I think we're going to be living, my hunch is that we're going to be living in a world where that's still at best only partly what we can do. So I think our committee needs to start thinking about that in August, so it can be a topic of discussion for September with the advisory committee, so that after the October advisory committee meeting, we spend the rest of October really deeply engaging with the public. Thoughts on that?
I think process-wise, Jessica, that makes sense. And I know this is discussion for a future meeting. My first initial thought is an appropriate way to engage would probably be via like a Google form, and the hopeful ability, we could produce some paper versions of that Google form and bring them into some communities in a safe way, whether it is outside of grocery stores or other social service places, to make sure that we are reaching different communities, and we could identify who might be the most comfortable in doing that. But I do see it kind of being a hybrid.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
And then another thing, and not to derail or go back to what we were just talking about, but I do think one thing that really needs to be established at the August advisory committee meeting is I think we do need to be very clear with what the final deliverable for the advisory committee will be. And this does get to Simone's point, that will be delivered to OSCE. And I'm saying this speaking from my experience working partially with the ESSA committee, that I think there was a little bit of a lack of clarity after the report card part was done, after the accountability system part was done, what the final ESSA report deliverable was going to look like and how that was communicated to the committee. And so I think if we could be very thoughtful, intentional, and upfront about, by December 8th, this is the report that this committee will be delivering and establishing. These are the components that we anticipate being in this report. And really, to my point earlier about kind of guide rails, I think will be really, really helpful. Obviously recognizing that things could change, but I do think that if we can be very intentional and provide that direction and guidance on the front end so that members know as they're having these discussions and as things are being framed, that it is all being framed with this final deliverable that will be transmitted to OSSI in mind.
Yep. Karen, before I move towards sort of closing, I haven't heard too much from you, and I want to make sure that's not because I haven't asked. Karen, I'm not sure if you're on mute or. Okay. Anything else that, because I think, Alex, that's a really good point around, and Simone, I appreciate you bringing it up too. Like, I think we do have to get clearer with people on what the guiding principles are and are not, what they include, what we have authority and opportunity to influence, and where our influence ends. I'm thinking about some ways to do that.
Yeah, and Jessica, that might be a conversation for us to have offline, just like really think about, okay, what are the authorities that we do have as a state board, and being very explicit about that. And to John Paul's point, to not punt or defer, but to say, yes, these issues are really important and they will be raised, but the state board does not have the authority to fully take that part on. And this is the space that we need to work within.
Yeah. I also want to follow up with Justin Tooley to get his take on last night's meeting, because he was the OSSI representative who was there. I want to also note, like, OSSI is working on a lot of things at the moment, so I know this is not top of mind for them, because it is not yet squarely in their work bucket, but I want to make sure that we keep engaged with them so that any reflections that Justin has to offer, any points of concern or places where he wants to make sure we're clear on guardrails, that we have those in hand so that we're not surprised by them at any point.
Yep.
All right. With that, I want to thank you all for engaging and going through this. Mark, I really appreciate the insights you're offering from the Graduates Task Force. A lot of that now is spinning how to make some of those in-person facilitation things work digitally. We'll definitely be following up with Caitlin and the team on how we might use some of the tools at our disposal. The next big thing for this committee will be, we'll put together a follow-up email to the SISIC and share that as a draft with you all in case there's any adjustments you want to make to the guiding questions, et cetera. We'll then put that out to folks, give them a chance to read those standards and get back to us in advance of the August 11th meeting. At our August working session, I'll have a draft of the agenda for that August 11th meeting so that you all can engage and review and reflect on that, along with some of these facilitation things worked out. And then we'll go onward into that work. I don't think there's anything at all social studies related that's coming up in the public meeting. So I think our August working session is the next time we'll really revisit that. Anything else for the good of the order?
Not me.
Cool. All right. Thank you all. And thank you, Simone. I know we only get you for a few weeks in your fellowship, but your input already has been really helpful. And I'm really thankful to have another voice in this work who's helping us push and grow as we move on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you. All right, bye all. Enjoy the heat.
Bye.
Stay cool.
See
See
you
you
in an hour and a half, right?
Bye.
Bye.